Thank you to all the friends of BC Archives for putting on presentations during this extraordinary time. And also thank everybody who is attending for being here on a gorgeous Sunday afternoon. I also want to thank Touchwood Editions in Victoria, the publisher. And I do know that there is at least one of Telegraph Cove who is actually joining us as an audience member today. So that's really makes it even more special for me. Right, okay, well, let me show you a photo of Telegraph Cove. There we are, circa about 1954, 1955. Now, for those of you who don't know Telegraph Cove, it's a tiny community on the northeast coast of Vancouver Island. It was founded and named by my family, the Wastells, in 1912. As you can see, it's barely 50 meters across. It averaged about 15 houses that were built on stilts around a circular boardwalk, with the mill, the sawmill, on the left side there, and the general store on the right near the edge of the houses, being the only businesses as such in Telegraph Cove. Now, this place was tiny and isolated. You could only get in by boat for most of its productive sawmill history. And yet, I realized that this tiny little place was directly impacted by all the events that were happening in Canada throughout the 20th century. The Depression, the war, occupation, internment, the baby boom, social change, immigration, and the transition from a resource-based economy to tourism. At its average year, there were maybe 45 people that lived in Telegraph Cove. And now, well, I say now, but in an average normal summer, it will attract about 100,000 people from all over the world as tourists and adventurers. And it still exists. It exists because of the people who live there and have encouraged its evolvement. It started as a telegraph line station in 1912. Then there was a saltery and a box mill for 1925 to 1935. Then it was a robust sawmill operation for about 50 years. And then it turned into a recreational, which it still enjoys, where there's hiking and fishing and camping and whale watching. In fact, Telegraph Cove was the site of British Columbia's very first whale watching operation. My great-grandparents founded and named the place. My grandparents lived there all their adult lives there and built the town, as it were. My mom and my aunt were born up there, and I was lucky enough to spend all my childhood and adolescent and university summers up there visiting. So I direct connections to the place that go back right from the 1920s to the present day. And stories, materials, photos were that have been difficult, if not impossible, for. And I got the idea of writing a book when I was actually in Telegraph Cove in a beautiful September day in 2015, when I was up there for an event, and there were people coming up to me asking about my grandfather and how amazing it was to be building a business in this remote place, and my great-grandfather who founded the place. And I realized that nobody was asking me about my grandmother or my great-grandmother, who I actually knew were much more interesting people. And that's when I thought, okay, I could write about them. So I had a project. And I realized that this is a project that maybe I might be the only person on the planet who could actually write, because I was lucky enough to have the source material right from the very beginning. Now, no one works in history in isolation. We all stand on the back of our ancestors and the people that have gone before us. So the big question was, where do I start? I started with the family archives. I was given several boxes of documents and materials and memoirs by my great-grandfather, and even cassettes that my grandmother had recorded in the 1970s of her life. So that was amazing to hear her voice after all these years after her death. I was able to interview my mom and my aunt, who are both still alive. And my mom, thankfully, has the most incredible memory. And so she was able to provide a huge amount of starting information. I also box some fantastic documents, such as the original survey that was done in 1910, which indicated that it was for logging, and which also meant to me that it was not a site that was suitable to look at as a town or a fishing station. So documents can actually tell you a lot more than just the surface information. And this picture here is a picture of the Wastel family, my grandparents, Fred and Emma, and my aunt, Pat, on the right, and my mom, the youngest child there, Beatrice. I had been brought up knowing that there were different names for the business, and I could never really understand where these names came from or why there were different ones. But I found documentation that confirmed that the Broughton Straits Trading Company Limited was incorporated in 1925 with $10,000 of capital divided into 100 shares. This was the start of the fish saltery and the box mill operation. I knew that Japanese workers were given shares in the company that they could then sell back to the company if they ever left. But the proof of that was fantastic when I found this actual share certificate, which tells, again, so much about the number of shares, the name of the company, how it was divided up, and who had the shares. In this case, these are the shares of the Japanese businessmen that my great-grandfather and grandfather partnered with in the saltery and box mill operation. So then I made my first foray to the BC archives and spent a glorious week right from when it opened and right until when it closed, going through all sorts of context material. There was, documents and charts and maps, interviews with old pioneers, including my grandfather. And again, it was lovely to hear his voice again after so many decades after his death. But when I was researching these archives, I realized that there really is very little about the women who lived in these places, and even more or even less by women about what these places were like. So I really wanted to help write that balance. When my great-grandparents moved to the area, it was 1909. Duke, my great-grandfather, Alfred Marmaduke Wastel, but known as Duke, he was hired to manage the BC Fishing and Packing Company's sawmill in Alert Bay, which is on Cormorant Island, about an hour away from Telegraph Cove by boat in those days. At that time in Alert Bay, there were maybe 100 members of the Kwakwaka'wakw First Nation, maybe 20 white settlers, and a few single Chinese men. The company gave my great-grandparents a house and a nice garden and a male Chinese cook and a tennis court. In fact, this tennis court. Now, Alert Bay already had 5 tennis courts in 1909 on grass, clay, and one on wooden boards, which was the least popular because when a ball hit the crack in between the boards, it would go shooting off into an unpredictable trajectory. There was also badminton at the Anglican Church. There was singing and bridge games and boating and bathing, which my great-grandmother, Mame, loved. And there she is. She was always the captain of the family boats. She wore her hair in a bun. She always wore a dress, avowing that women who wore trousers were of loose morals. You can see Alert Bay there. Great-grandfather Duke was a terrible judge of people and money. And so my Mame then set about building and buying up land to build houses for rental income. At the time, there was no CPP, no old age pension of any kind, so people had to look after their own futures. Now in the city, women were not able to take out mortgages for property, as banks did not lend money to women. But for Mame, it was easy. All she had to do was register a deed for the land and get a special survey made, because the crescent shape of Cormorant Island meant dividing the property was sometimes a little tricky. But there were few wells, which were all dry in the summer. So people would have an outhouse in the woods, and then they'd either bathe in a tub by the stove or in the ocean. So no plumbing, very little electricity, meant building a house was actually relatively easy. And she could actually get a plot of land for about $75. Duke bought out a bad loan on some property, 376 acres of that property, across from Alert Bay on Vancouver Island. Mame was furious. She thought this was a complete waste of money. In 1912, this logged site became the hub, the terminus of the telegraph line that ran up to Vancouver Island. Now, the terminus was looking at where there was the population, which was Alert Bay. But Alert Bay was on an island, and so it would have been very costly to run cable under the ground. Therefore, Telegraph Cove was chosen because it was very protected. It had high, steep cliffs that protected it against the winter winds, and it was easy enough for an operator to keep the line live, i.e. away from downed trees. For that reason, Duke, who owned the land at this time, called it Telegraph Cove. In the mid-20s, Japanese partner, Charlie Nakamura, with my great-grandfather and grandfather, put in a fish saltery. And that long, low building that you see there in the picture was the fish saltery. And the little building on top of it, it looks like it's actually sitting on the roof, but it's actually on the hill behind. That was the original line shack, 15 by 8 or 12 by 18 feet. Now, in 1929, the stock market crashed and the Alert Bay sawmill was shut down. So my grandfather, who was newly married with a tiny baby, was encouraged by Mame to move to Telegraph Cove and expand the box mill for the saltery operation into a full-size sawmill and handle a lot of the local lumber needs. Now, people in that era at that time were so capable. You know, they built houses, they devised the boardwalk system here in Telegraph Cove on a slight angle so that wood could be trolleyed from the mill to the dock easily. Mame's brothers and also the Japanese workers who lived in Telegraph Cove even built the company tugboats. And this was the image. This was probably taken in the 1928, 29. This was the image that my grandmother was confronted when she moved to Telegraph Cove with her new baby into that tiny line shack. And I just feel for her every time I look at this picture. Now, she herself, Emma, born Emma McCoskrie, in her own right, but she was expected to live and work in Telegraph Cove in an unpaid capacity. Her mother had died when she was 3. She was brought up in Victoria by an elderly aunt and uncle. And she lived on the corner of Fairfield and Vancouver streets. In fact, there is an apartment building on the corner there that she built with Telegraph Cove lumber that still stands. And the little house next door to it was built by that uncle who adopted her and is there as a heritage property for the city of Victoria. She saw the Empress being built. She watched Victoria grow, but she really railed against her future of looking after these 2 older adopted parents. And so she became a nurse. She went to St. Joseph's Hospital in Victoria during the First World War and did her training during the pandemic of 1918, 1919, commonly known as the Spanish flu. Then she took jobs around BC and ended up in Alert Bay, where she met my grandfather, Fred. So in Telegraph Cove, she was the wife of the landowner and the boss, and she had to manage her own home, of course, and bring up 2 children. But she was also responsible for getting the school built in Telegraph Cove and having to be available for any and all emergencies 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year round. And that could be anything from fingers that were sawn off in a mill accident to babies that made an unexpectedly early arrival into the world. And because of that, she always had a medical bag filled with the material she would need. So for example, if she heard the sawmill whistle going toot, 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 she knew there was an emergency. She would grab her bag and rush down the stairs and around to the mill to see what would. Always had to be ready for anything that happened. And so she took to carrying that medical bag with her everywhere, even on picnics. And in this picture, you can actually see that medical bag in the lower left corner, ready to go in case there was suddenly a problem on the boat or a problem with the village that they were delivering lumber to. Now, I didn't want the book just to be about my family. I wanted it to be about all the women in Telegraph Cove who lived there. And for a number of reasons. One is that this community was different than the other logging camps that were littering the west coast of Canada at the time. There was no gambling, no alcohol, and no fights, which was rare. And this was because it was a family location with the school, and that was due to the women that lived there. As to find these women. I estimated that probably 500 people, probably less actually, ever called Telegraph Cove home. And of these, probably 100 of them were female. So I started to make a list of the women that I remembered from my childhood, who were the mothers of my summer school friends. And started to look for them. Now, of course, this is not easy. People move, they disappear, they die. Some women, you know, when they get married, they changed names, and maybe some of them didn't have children. Or some of them were there for such a very short period of time that they weren't even remembered. For example, in this picture, which was taken in about 1942, there was only one person that I was able to identify, and that is a young girl who is on the right side of the picture, wearing black and looking rather askance with her hair parted in the middle and two barrettes on either side. And I know this woman because that is my mother. So I started with my mother's Christmas card list as well, because she kept in touch with a lot of the women. So I would travel to the women that I could find. I would interview them using an app on my phone and just have a conversation and try to let them tell their story in their own words. I would also interview their daughters. If they had daughters, because I felt that was another side to what it was like to grow up female in a very male-oriented location. You know, it was difficult even in Christmas card lists if a name was misspelled or the phone number had changed or if they had died, or to but in the wrong generation to make use of the internet. Or if they had very common names, that was also very difficult to find them. If they had died, I tried to contact their husbands and brothers and sisters and children, which, you know, in order to get whatever information I could. I would then transcribe the interviews and then put them into sort of chronological biographical narrative. And as I was doing this, I realized that I was really weaving a tapestry where some threads of the women's lives were very short. They weren't there very long and little was known about them, except maybe their name. And others were there for 40 years. And this tapestry then was sort of a synthesis of the information of what it was like living in such an unusual place. Now, I know that memory is subjective, and taking a fact from one person about an event and then taking a fact from someone else about the same event didn't always jibe. And so that was part of the task, is to take the information I gleaned from historical and contextual information and the subjective lens that the women were providing and put it into a narrative that reflected reality. Now, this woman represented a narrative that was of greater importance, really, than her short time in Telegraph Cove, which was between 1940 and 1942. This is Nancy O'Cura with her baby daughter, Marion. She had died by the time I had started this project. And I only knew of her name and knew of her through interviewing one of the other women who had been a child in Telegraph Cove during this time. Then I was able to access that was produced by her grandson, this woman, Nancy's grandson, who lived in Toronto. And I was able to find him and get further information. And then I went to the Nikkei Center in Burnaby and got further information about what it was like for the Japanese to live in places such as Telegraph Cove and to read other people's experiences. And I know that there were a lot of Japanese families that lived up in that part of BC's coast. Telegraph Cove was mostly Japanese families for probably its first 15, 20 years. It was a really strong community. They were welcomed. They could build a house. They could have a garden. They had access to the sea. There was a school. And so the community actually grew during the Depression as people would come north trying to find work. And my grandparents never turned anyone away who asked. But after Pearl Harbor was bombed in December of 1941, Canada bowed to the existing racism, primarily through against the fishers, the successful fishers of BC, and interned anyone of Japanese heritage away from the coast. Most of the Telegraph Cove families of Japanese heritage were warned ahead of time and left of their own accord. But this family stayed. For a variety of reasons. They hadn't been there long and life was good and they felt that they were safe. But they were taken by the government. They were split up. The husband went to work on road crew. Marion and her mother Nancy here were sent to the Peony to live in the agricultural building for a bitter winter. They were able to get together. They moved to the prairies and worked on farms through the rest of the war. When the war finished, they were still coast. That order was not rescinded until 1949. So they moved to Toronto because the CN Rail was actually hiring Japanese workers on their rails as porters. The irony is that Nancy O'Cura here was not Japanese herself. She was born in Steveston near Richmond, Vancouver, and a Canadian citizen. The Royal Canadian Air Force actually occupied Telegraph Cove during the Second World War. They took over the mill in order to build two airports, one in Cole Harbour, the Cole Harbour in north end of Vancouver Island, and also the airport in Port Hardy, which is still there, made of Telegraph Cove lumber. And it was also to establish a presence in fear of a potential Japanese invasion. The RCAF took over all the accommodation at the Cove, fired all the workers. And so the mill, which operated normally with 11 trained men, was now operating with 60 untrained men. So my grandmother's medical bag was in more use than usual with mill accidents. The RCAF took over my grandfather's boat and painted it battleship gray. And my grandfather didn't have a job, but he was allowed to stay because he owned the land. The school stayed open, which was a blessing for my mother and my aunt, who were young school children at the time. Now, after the war, when the RCAF left, the boat was given back to my grandparents and they had to start the business all up again. But this sort of thing was happening everywhere in Canada. Now, children who are living in Europe during the war, right in the middle of the war, later immigrated to Canada as young. Future that was absolutely impossible for them in post-war Europe. One of these women is Eva Vinderskov here, who was born in 1933 in Berlin. So you can imagine what that was like growing up right in the heart of Nazi Germany during the Second World War. She was educated, a great athlete, and she wanted to travel, but with very limited options. She married a Dane and lived in Denmark with him for a while, but as soon as she opened her mouth, people could hear the German accent and didn't want to have anything to do with her. So they immigrated to Canada. Her husband became the Telegraph Cove mill manager for over 20 years. And so she was then the wife of the boss, but she was subservient to the landowner. A situation that was actually very familiar to Europeans with the class system born in their upbringing. Because I see this sophisticated European woman with her hand-tailored, handmade wool suit in the wilds of British Columbia, right beside huge beams, and you know, living in a very rustic, wild, isolated place, and being happy to be there because, incredibly, it was a much better life than what she would have had in Europe. Another woman with a similar, completely different history is this woman, Lisa Zigiotti, who was born and grew up in northern Italy during the fascist regimes as well as the war. She immigrated to Canada with her husband and brought up 5 children in a very traditional Italian marriage. She had very little support for her own personal development, but she put herself through high school by correspondence. She learned how to drive, and she found work at the next door log sorting operation in Beaver Cove. She was hired originally as the tea lady because, of course, she's just a woman, and yet she worked her way up through the ranks through sheer determination, and she ended up becoming one of British Columbia's very first female log scalers. And log scaling is an incredibly technical job. You have to assess the value that any particular log is going to provide, knowing the species of wood, but making very, very specific calculations to derive the most value out of each log that would then go to the mill and be cut. It's a very difficult exam. Many people take 2 or 3 times to do the exam. And Lisa passed the exam her very first time at the age of. Now, Telegraph Cove, like elsewhere in Canada before and after the Second World War, was particularly in resource-heavy locales, was very much a male-dominated environment, and there were very few paying jobs for women. Options were limited, and the pay was quite poor. Now, teaching was one of those options that was available, and all the teachers in Telegraph Cove's one-room schoolhouse were women. The school was opened in 1935. My grandmother actually went to the superintendent of schools in Victoria and petitioned to get a school. And she was told, you have to build the building, you have to build accommodation, you have to hire the teacher, and then the government would reimburse for the teacher's salary. So that's what she did. Of course, living in a sawmill town, building a school and accommodation was not so difficult. And Telegraph Cove, being so isolated, could not pay a very high salary, and so was lucky to get what teachers they could. The government also said that there had to be 10 children in the school at any time for it to be operating, and there were rarely 10 children in Telegraph Cove. So my grandparents would fudge the numbers in order to keep the school open and the teachers paid. But they were, and it's so very lucky. The women that came up to Telegraph Cove, there were some amazing standouts. For example, there was one woman, Doris Gray, who went up as a first-year teacher. She was tiny, she was almost blind, and she had a facial tic. So she would have been marginalized in many communities. And so it was very hard for her to get a job. But she came to Telegraph Cove, worked there for many years, and then after she left the Cove and taught a few other places, her master's and her PhD at Columbia University in New York. She taught herself Braille. She wrote textbooks in English and in Braille. She became a professor and was very well known for dealing with children, not only who had sight issues, but also who had brain trauma. Another teacher, Grace Darcy, fled an abusive marriage with 3 young children. And she worked at Telegraph Cove. And during the summer, she worked to study to get her high school ticket. When she left Telegraph Cove, she taught high school. And then she went and got her master's at Stanford University. And then she ended up being in charge of all the school library system for the province of Manitoba. And these women were in tiny Telegraph Cove, extraordinary. All the students who grew up in Telegraph Cove look back and acknowledge the fact that they were extraordinarily fortunate to have these women as the people that could open the world out to them, and dedicated their love of reading books and study and their future development to these teachers. Office work was another option open to women. The woman on the right here, Thelma Burton, lived in Telegraph Cove for almost 40 years, actually 45 years, longer than 40 years. And she was the school or the general store manager. The woman on the left was Stella Kulczewski, who was Telegraph Cove's only female cook after the RCAF cleared out and before men in the bunkhouse were then able to shift for themselves. Of all the bookkeepers that Telegraph Cove had, the 2 longest serving and best by far were women. Collectively, the 2, Dorothy Ashwin first and then Annabelle Wardlaw after, years. And the only post officer in Telegraph Cove was also a woman, Mary McDonald. Now, women came from all over the world to live in Telegraph Cove, but none by choice. By the 1970s and 80s, women's roles were flexing all over North America. Canada's baby boomers, born between 1945 and 1965, were experiencing a life that was very different from that of their mothers and grandmothers. For one thing, there were so many of them. Every year, after the World War, there were about 15%, about double, 50%, well, 100%, really double, 100% more babies being born in each of the 15 years after the war than had been born in the 15 years before the war. Huge social shifts as well. There was access to mortgages that you did not have to be married. You could access capital and start a business. However, just because something's possible doesn't mean it was easy. Women had to have thick skins and probably put more into the game than men at the time. They were still considered the carers and the mothers of the family, first and foremost, even as they were juggling the demands of a job, for which they were still paid less than men who were doing comparable work. But inflation was high in those periods, and 2 paychecks became necessary. 2 of the women who were in Telegraph Cove at this time, Anne Borroman and Donna McKay, became partners in the first whale watching operation in British Columbia. That started off as scuba diving charters with their husbands in 1979. Anne and Donna took up marketing of this business before marketing was a they designed logos and sourced things that they could then sell, and did a sort of a trial and error promotional period of trying to build the business and get it well established and known. They also started a catering company where they started by making meals for all the boat guests that went out on scuba diving and then whale watching trips. And this turned into an actual professional catering company where they marketed products. As the success grew and more people, including tourists, were starting to come to the North Island. And this with having 5 babies between them. Gathering all the women's stories for me took about 2 solid years of sourcing, interviewing, and research and transcribing the interviews and cross-referencing overlapping narratives of same events and same eras and epochs. Within that time, I also did research on the social context and the historical and the geographical context in which these women lived. They were candid, they were honest, and often courageous. There were a lot of conversations that they had with me that would never have happened in my grandmother's day, even over a kitchen table with a friend. And sharing truths, whether it's to a friend or to the world, is still not easy, particularly by women who tend to judge themselves and judge other as well quite harshly, and are very protective of their own, their families, and their communities' histories. And so I really appreciated being able to talk to as many women as possible and trying to get at the intersection of the that were shared, collective, or universal. I spend a lot of time at libraries and museums, city archives like the New Westminster, Vancouver, Victoria, also UVic and UBC archives. The regional district plans are very helpful when you're examining what's going on in a region. I read a lot of books and examined a lot of historical material. BC Archives was the best by far for background material. But as I say, they had a wealth of documents, newspapers, charts, maps, photos, and other official documents. I also found that the Campbell Rivers Archives Research Center and the Alert Bay Public Library and Museum were excellent. Regional material, but also answering questions that no one else was able to answer. The internet, of course, is a vast repository of information, but you have to really know what you're looking for and how to determine whether it is accurate. And I knew that a lot of the material I was sourcing would never make it into the final manuscript, but to me it was important to have that solid foundation of detail in the information. I also was lucky in that I got a suitcase, a small suitcase full of photographs, negatives, about 500 or 600 photo negatives. Now, in the 1920s, cameras were new technology, and my grandparents were in their 20s. So everybody had pictures of boats and picnics and people and buildings and the development of the manifestation of the region. Interestingly, though, there were no night shots because flash photography around in the 1920s. They were all negatives, of course, so that was the tricky thing, is trying to determine which ones might be of value or not. This photo was a family picture. I have no idea how it came about, but it is a picture of the very early days of Alert Bay. Two British settlers actually came to the area and built a cannery and a sawmill and a dock. And so the First Nations, the main First Nations village, was actually at the mouth of the Ninkish River. Namgis was the name of the village. That was the village that was visited by Captain George Vancouver in 1792. And with the dock and work, the villagers would slowly move across to Alert Bay, or to Cormorant Island, and establish Alert Bay. And you can see there the First Nations village is being built, and the trees behind have been taken down in order to build the village, and also to provide lumber for the sawmill, the box factory for the fish cannery. The Alert Bay was actually named after the survey ship HMS Alert, and that is the HMS Alert in the far right of that picture, which was taken in about 1872. I found out later on that a great uncle of mine had actually served on HMS Alert, not at this time in this place, but that was maybe a reason why this picture came into the family. So I was very lucky. I did not have to access archives for photographs. I accessed the private collections of the women for pictures that were taken in later years that my grandparents didn't have photos of. I got lots of photos that were outside, but women's lives were lived in the interior, working their own. And there were very few pictures that showed what life was like inside. For example, I really wanted to find a photo of a sawdust stove. all the women in Telegraph Cove had to deal with a sawdust stove, which is, for anyone there who's listening to this, who's ever worked with the sawdust stoves, knows how temperamental and difficult it is. You had to work with sawdust that wasn't wet. You had to make sure there was enough of the sawdust in the hopper so that it could withstand in the nighttime. So you'd wake up and you actually had a warm stove, because that stove heated your entire house. It also heated the water that you used, and it provided the morning coffee and the lunchtime meals and so on. So you always had to make sure that the sawdust stove was operating as best it could. There was a dial. You can see the circular dial there on the stove that I was able to get a picture of, that I was told was more ornamental than practical, and being able to turn out perfect chiffon cakes, as one woman who lived in Telegraph Cove did, was definitely an art more than a science. This picture was actually in the bottom drawer of one of the women's cupboards after she dug out every picture she could on my request, and actually found this picture of a sawdust stove. So I was so thrilled that even some of these historical documents that I wasn't able to find in archives or in newspapers or anywhere on the internet, that the women came through for me and were able to help in that regard too. Social life was so limited for women back then. There was radio. Everybody listened to the radio. And about there was probably a television, but it only would get one station, and that was intermittent. There were Saturday dances in the early days, and then this segued into movie nights on Saturdays. And this is a photo of a movie night in 1957. Thursday morning for many, many decades was the day that the Union steamship made its run into Telegraph Cove. These steamships ran up and down the coast and delivered fresh food, meat, vegetables, fruit, newspapers, mail, paint, fabric, everything to Telegraph Cove except lumber. And it became a community event. The men and women of the Cove would get dressed up. The men actually wore suits. The women wore their best dresses, high heels, hats, gloves, and would all meet down at the dock and have a visit and a little bit of social time before and after the boat came in, where they would pick up whatever it was that they had ordered. And remember, these people were in their 20s and 30s. Excuse me, they were young. And this social gathering that they had once a week was really important, because most of the time, although the men had camaraderie in the mill, the women were working inside their homes on their own. And so the boat day became a bigger event than it would be. And I know that people on the prairies had the train. There were other small towns that had maybe a horse and wagon or a truck that would deliver, that operated in the same way. There were other boats that came into the cove. There were mission boats that provided religious services. There were traveling salesmen. There was a boat called the Jolly Jumbo, which came in on board. And there was even a dental boat, although nobody wanted to go to the dental boat and would avoid it if possible, because there's no anesthetic and you're on a boat. And so you can imagine that you'd have to really, really be in pain in order to allow yourself to be put through that horror. While writing this book, I was really struck by the universality of these women's experiences, regardless of their race or era or epoch in which they lived in the Cove. And I was really struck by how the role of women in the 20th century Canada was mirrored by this tiny location where maybe at any given time there'd be 15 or 20 women at most. In this picture, there's probably the largest cohort of women that lived in Telegraph Cove at any one time. This picture was taken in 1961. And even again, with all the research I've done and the cross discussion with the women who are alive, I can identify a little bit more than half of these women, and the other half I have no idea, and no one else seems to have any idea who they are. So I'm always hopeful that somebody will see a picture and contact me and say, that's my mom or my grandmother. It was very difficult to choose an ending to the book. The tourism sector is still going, though people who moved up there and started some of the recreational facilities are still living their history. So in the end, I decided that the best way would be to, at the transition from the sawmill years into the tourism years. And so the whale watching women who kind of straddled that era were the right way to end it, as it gave an inkling of what Telegraph Cove would be in later years. It was also at the time when the road that joined the North Vancouver Island was put in, which wasn't until 1979. Now, it's very easy to fall into nostalgia with a place that's got the sort of picture book prettiness of Telegraph Cove as it is now. But these lives were really challenging and at best. And so honoring the women that lived there with authenticity was really important to me, and something I hope this book achieves. Now, before I answer any of your questions, I would like to add that I wanted the book, which is here, to have a legacy beyond storytelling. So I'm donating all my royalties to 2 charities that are supporting women's health and wellness: the Campbell River Hospital Foundation and the Campbell River North Island Transition Society, who support women's health and wellness programs. So I'd be very happy to answer any questions, whether it's about the history of Telegraph Cove, or the photos, or the process of researching and writing the book, and even the publishing, as this was my first book, and that was a journey in itself.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, for a wonderful presentation. Your narrative is so evocative, and the story behind your research is fascinating. Our question answer moderator, our question answer period will be moderated by our Vice President, Lara Wilson. So Lara, can you?
Certainly. If everybody could please just use the chat to add your questions. There were a couple of comments, Jennifer, as you were speaking. The first one was from Alexandra Darcy, and I'm not sure if Alexandra is still on the Zoom or not. And I missed who she was saying, who her comment was about, but she said her master's was from the University of Manitoba, and she did her articling at Stanford. That's my grandmother.
Ah, so this is Grace Darcy, one of the school teachers of Telegraph Cove.
Yeah. And Anne Borroman wanted to let everyone know that they had a stove like that at the McDonald House until 1983.
Yes, Anne Borroman was one of the partners in the first whale watching operation in Telegraph Cove.
Okay. And Anne says, as always, wonderful hearing from you. Thank you, Anne.
Nice to know that there's one of the resilient women at the Cove right there. As always, throughout this whole process, they were always behind me and supporting me, and I so much appreciate their support.
Mm-hmm. Just some thanks from Kelly on the wonderful presentation, and from Christine as well. What a delightful presentation. Thanks so much. While we wait for any additional questions, Jennifer, I was curious about the Indigenous people that were living at Telegraph Cove, the Kwakwaka'wakw people. Do we know who they were?
There were actually no Kwakwaka'wakw who lived in Telegraph Cove, which was really one of the interesting things I found, is that for one thing, Telegraph Cove is very small. and almost circular and quite hidden. Until you actually come upon the opening of the cove, you don't know it's there. And Kwakwaka'wakw villages, among other coastal First Nations villages, tended to prefer open sightlines so that they could see who is coming, whether they were friend or foe. They also felt, and there's a lot of anecdotal but also written documentation to indicate that the entire area where Englewood was, Beaver Cove, Telegraph Cove, Bowser Cove, that whole strip of that coastline was considered the provenance of Sunakwa, who is the wild woman of the woods. And so it was dangerous to go into her territory. The First Nations village was Namgis, which is a little bit north of Telegraph Cove. In fact, there were two villages on either side of the river delta. The Namgis or the Nimpkish River was and is a very rich salmon river. So that is where the main village was. So even though Telegraph Cove had fresh water and a little bit of a shingle beach, evidence, either written or geographical or anthropological, that anyone actually went to Telegraph Cove, except possibly to hide out in a storm because it was so protected from winter winds.
Okay, thank you. Here's a comment from Susan Ness. Wonderful presentation. I'm from Sointula, grew up here in the 50s and 60s and returned in retirement. Our house was built in 1951 from lumber from the Telegraph Cove mill. I visited the cove several times on my dad's boat. Do you know how closely connected the two communities were? All I know is that the Sointula Finns certainly brought lumber.
Yes, there are a lot of houses. In fact, there are houses designed by my great uncle that were built of Telegraph Cove lumber in the area, Sointula among them. My grandfather was 9 years old when he moved to Alert Bay. And so all his growing up years were in that area. And there's lots of photos of people rowing to dances in Sointula. There were dances in Alert Bay and other parts, but Sointula had a real orchestra and there was no alcohol. And so it was actually very popular. People didn't want to go to places where there was alcohol, but to have a chance to dance to a real orchestra. So people would row in these heavy wooden rowboats, and they would row the local, beauties or their favorite girl and row to Sointula, dance for hours and hours, well into the early dawn, and then they would row back again. Now, this was regardless of what the weather was like, of what the tides were like. It was raining, there was a strong tides, and it was dark, sometimes a moonless night, and deter them from these Saturday night dances, which, as I say, the Sointula dances were the most popular.
Thank you. And Susan says, yes, the Sointula dances were well known in the area. Somebody
In
from
fact,
our,
actually,
okay.
there's a small town on Malcolm Island, just south of Sointula, called Kaliva. It's not there anymore. There's Kaliva Road, but there was a small town. There was a one-room schoolhouse there, and the woman who actually was the school teacher there in the teens and early 20s was Mary. She became Mary McDonald, who lived in Telegraph Cove and was married to the first mill manager. So yeah, the Malcolm Island figures very prominently. I remember growing up there, and we would always have picnics in Mitchell Bay, which is a fantastic area on Malcolm Island. I love Sointula. It's definitely well worth a visit to anybody who's interested in exploring the North Island.
And I think Sointula was profiled in a recent Knowledge Network documentary, I think called, I want to say Coastal Voices, but anyways. A question from Jesse. The suitcase of photos sounds incredible. Do you have further plans for the interview recordings and photos you collected?
That's a good question. I have everything. I've still kept everything. And I use a lot of the photos in my social media because some of them are so great and so evocative of the time. So I still have them, and I am trying to digitize them bit by bit. It's quite expensive to print and digitize. And so I am doing that slowly just to maintain the archive. Whether I do something more specific with to be determined.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if anybody has any additional questions. I realize that we're approaching 3 o'clock. Oh, here's something from Angie Bain. Are there any stories that you were unable to fully understand due to lack of documentation or research leads? If you were to add anything to this book, what story would you most want to tell?
Excellent question. I don't know if there was anything I was unable to find, except there were a lot of the women that had lived there, maybe for only 6 months or a year, that I was unable to get their story. Thankfully, I have heard from a few who have contacted me since, and I've recorded their story or their mother's stories, and I have that in case there's ever a second edition. I can add that. But really, there were stories that I would have liked to have told, but I had to also honor the women's feelings, and there were aspects of some of the stories told that they were quite protective about because of the community or of their family or of other people, and so I had to honor that. And so there were, I wouldn't say scandals. Telegraph Cove was, kind of pretty scandal-free locale, but some of the stories that are a little bit more dramatic, I had to curtail. And of course, I wasn't able to tell the stories of the women post 1990s, the 2000s, the women that are still there now. I would have liked very much to include them, but it would have made the book even longer, and it would have been very hard to then determine the ending, because when you write up to the minute, a book is dated. Whereas when you choose an ending that's set in history, it kind of then hints at life beyond. So if there was ever a second edition, I would hope it would be in such a time that I could then include what happened after the stories that are in the book as they are now.
Thank you, Jennifer. Another question. Did you use any specific software to compile all your research? I'm working on a family history and it is overwhelming compiling it. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. We traveled to Telegraph Cove on our boat when growing up in the summers.
Oh, great. Oh, no, I use Scribner to write the book, which was quite helpful. I also did just Word documents, and I used an Excel spreadsheet to kind of keep track of things. But really, it was pretty much piles of paper in boxes and photographs tabulated on, in files, digital files, and that worked for me. But I know how unwieldy. I've been doing further family tree research on ancestry during this pandemic, and it can get very unwieldy. So it's good to try to develop some kind of a system that will work for you. Whether it's just an Excel spreadsheet was good for me, and I could just then keep track of what was there, where it overlapped, and where it was stored.
Thanks, Jennifer. And just we have concluding just thanks from various folks, including Darren Borrowman. Thank you, Jennifer, and the FBCA for the presentation. Nice to see some familiar faces here today. Great presentation, says Amy. Barbara Nasadik says, wonderful presentation. Thank you for your hard work. And Christine, great. Thank you again. I think that's about it.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the feedback, and your participation is lovely to talk to a group of people who are engaged in history, but also maybe the location. It sounds like a lot of you have either been to Telegraph Cove or know about Telegraph Cove, or maybe have spent time in similar types of locations, either virtually or through books or in reality.